What is going on, Headliner Nation? Jake, Fantasy Headliners. Hopefully everyone's doing well out there today, where we're talking about the running backs. We're going to start and sit here for Turkey Week, the week of Thanksgiving, week 12 of fantasy football. Now, before we get into all these matchups, which there are timestamps down below for, there's a couple things we need to cover here before we get into that. The first thing, there are no buys this week. As we go through this video, it may seem like there's more starts than normal. Remember, no teams are on a bye, and there's some lower tier guys this week that have some really good matchups. Guys like Devin Singletary, Latavius Murray, Miles Sanders, that maybe may not be starts this week, but due to their matchups, it's kind of hard not to. We also have a few backfields now that are no longer really splitting carries, like Denver, right? No more Melvin Gordon. Chicago, it's just the David Montgomery show. Kansas City seems to pretty much just be Isaiah Pacheco. Pittsburgh, no Jaylen Warren with the injury, a lot more Najee Harris. So you may see a few more starts than usual, but that's okay. The point of this video is to take the information and apply it to your league and your settings, your scoring, your overall lineup, and make the best decisions possible. The rankings will be out later today as well. Then next, our fantasy football draft guide for 2023 is available for pre-order right now. And because it's the week of Black Friday, you better believe there's a sale attached to it. If you want your draft guide for next year ready to go, 30% off if you order by the end of the day Monday, which is the 28th of your fantasy football draft guide. Make sure you get it pre-ordered right now. It's something that a lot of people love every single year, and next year's is going to be a straight banger. And then if you haven't joined us on Prize Picks yet, there is a free square this coming up week. Justin Jefferson only needs 1 yard to hit it. It's a free square. Make sure you sign up, hit that Justin Jefferson prop. You only got to get one more guy right to make some money. And you better believe we're probably going to have a few of them sprinkled throughout our videos here over this week. So make sure you stay tuned and look out for those. But now is the time you've been waiting for. We're diving into all the matchups starting on Thanksgiving. The first of 3 games, the Buffalo Bills and Detroit Lions. And why not just kick it off right here with, damn it, Devin Singletary of the Buffalo Bills, currently sitting at running back 23 overall on the season, but has back-to-back games with touchdowns, which is very nice, which means also back-to-back games with 15-plus fantasy points, and has played in over 70% of the snaps in 5 straight. Then bringing over Nyheim Hines hasn't really affected Devin Singletary. He's had 15-plus touches now in back-to-back games on the season, averaging right around 14 or so. But now they get a matchup going up against Detroit, and that probably makes your tail wag a little bit, because Detroit allows 21.6 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, but slow the roll. That number is definitely boosted because of how poorly they played to start the season. This is a different Lions team over the last month, and they are playing a lot better on defense. This isn't just some pushover matchup anymore. When it comes to injuries, we know Josh Allen isn't 100% healthy, and that could be, part of the reason why we see Devin Singletary scoring some more points here as of late. The ceiling, not overly high. When I think about Devin Singletary's ceiling, I kind of feel like I'm in like a McDonald's play place. And when you get in one of those cubes that has like the round window, like there's a ceiling above you, but it's like really short. Like that's how I feel about Devin Singletary. But in this type of matchup, even though it's not a smash start, he's still somebody who I don't mind starting here this week with that potential of scoring over 10 fantasy points. A low-end running back 2 in my rankings for Devin Singletary. How about his opponents? It's Jamal. I lead the league in rushing touchdowns, Williams and DeAndre Swift. Now, Jay Will is just racking up these touchdowns at a crazy rate, even with DeAndre Swift back in the lineup. Right now, on the year, Jamal Williams is running back 10. Running back 10 and has 6 touchdowns over his last 4 games, 16-plus touches in 3 straight, and Swift himself even has back-to-back games with touchdowns, despite hardly touching the ball 10 times a week. He can't even get to 10 touches, but at least one of them's finding the end zone. He's only averaging like 7 touches a game right now, which is super crappy. If it wasn't for the end zone, scores the last couple weeks, he'd be absolutely killing you if you started him. I mean, Jamal Williams is just getting way more volume in this offense, and we've talked about this for multiple weeks. He's averaging 17 touches a game. He is the safer option in this backfield as of right now, but they're going against Buffalo. Buffalo is 21st in the league when it comes to points allowed to running backs at 21.6. The offensive line here, dealing with some injuries to Jonah Jackson and Frank Ragnow. That's something to pay attention to. And the usage says that DeAndre Swift isn't fully healthy, right? They say that he's fully healthy, but the usage says a little bit different. Everything on paper says to start Jamal Williams and sit DeAndre Swift. When you're looking at consistency, when you're looking at stats and volume and production, everything says to sit DeAndre Swift, but I have that gut feeling this week. It just seems to fit, right? Thanksgiving Day, going up against the Buffalo Bills, the Lions on a winning streak, trying to prove a point, maybe get some mental victories here and try to knock off Buffalo. Why not unleash DeAndre Swift? So like I said, the numbers say to sit DeAndre Swift, but if you're a gambling man, if you want to go out there and risk it for the biscuit, this may be the week for DeAndre Swift, if you so choose. How about the next game up? We have the New York Giants and Dallas Cowboys. Saquon Barkley absolutely sucked last week. 15 carries for 22 yards against those Detroit Lions that we just talked about, and Matt Breida stole a touchdown from him. I mean, he had 100-plus total yards or a touchdown in the 7 previous games of the season, so talk about your all-time major backfires. What movie is that from? Leave it down below in the comment section. Still averaging right around 24 touches a game, though, second most in the NFL. Dallas has been good against running backs, though, allowing only 16.8 fantasy points per game, 5th fewest in the league. When it comes to injuries, there's a lot of them in New York. You got 4 offensive linemen on the injury report. They just lost Wan'Dale Robinson. Daniel Bellinger, their tight end, is still out. And wide receiver Richie James is even questionable to play. We could see a lot of Saquon Barkley here this week. I mean, there's a lot really going against him, but there's really no way you can sit Saquon Barkley in fantasy football, so he's a start. Could be a rough game overall, though. For the Cowboys, you got Zeke Elliott and Tony Pollard. Tony Pollard is running back 8 overall on the season. That is absolutely crazy to think about. He has 6 touchdowns in his last 3 games and hasn't had less than 128 total yards in 3 straight games either. Zeke came back. They said he was going to be limited. Had 16 touches for 2 touchdowns last week. He was super inefficient. He needed those touchdowns, but still he got him right there on the goal line. Both these guys averaging right around 15 touches a game on the year. The Giants allow over 20.5 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. That's 15th in the league. Zeke still may be limited, and this offensive line may still be slightly banged up, but Tyron Smith, left tackle, he's getting closer to returning, so that's good news. But when it comes to X Factor, it's got to be Jerry Jones, right? His saying of, hashtag always Zeke and always wanting him in the lineup and getting the touches is apparent this year with the Dallas Cowboys. You saw it right away, right? Zeke's going to be limited. Zeke wasn't really limited. I expect him to play once again here this week. He got the immediate volume. He got the goal line work. Pollard is the more explosive player in this backfield, but in this matchup, I have no issue starting Tony Pollard. Zeke Elliott, maybe a little bit lower down the rankings, more of a flex play, but still a start nonetheless. How about the last game on Turkey Day? New England Patriots, Minnesota Vikings. Will start off with New England and Ramondre Stevenson and Damian Harris. And even though the season is starting to dwindle down, we need to continue Steven's season through the playoffs because the guy's still playing pretty freaking good. 10-plus fantasy points now in 8 straight games. Damian Harris kind of getting the scraps, the leftovers, but actually looked pretty dang good himself just last week, averaging 8 yards per carry and 14 yards per reception. Damian Harris is not a bad running back. Now, Stevenson, he's averaging right around 18 touches a game. Damian Harris struggling to get to that 10 mark. But I love the passing work that we're seeing from Ramondre Stevenson. He's had at least 6 targets now in 4 straight games. Going up against Minnesota, they allow the 9th most fantasy points to opposing running backs at 21.6 per game. Once again, multiple offensive linemen here on the injury report, David Andrews and Isaiah Wynn, so it's not like they're at full strength there up front, but at some point I have to expect that Damian Harris is going to take a little bit of this volume back, and as much as I hate to say that, as long as we still have the passing work there for Ramondre Stevenson, the floor is going to remain safer and make him the better start each and every week, at least until we see that from Damian Harris. So right now I'm starting Ramondre Stevenson, sitting Damian Harris. Their opponent's Dalvin Cook, of course. You're going to start Dalvin Cook. He's currently running back 11, and despite the Vikings just getting absolutely teabagged last week by the Cowboys, Dalvin actually had the best day of anyone on the Vikings roster. It's kind of weird, right? When you're trailing by that much, you're really not running a whole lot, and he didn't have a great game by any means, but compared to everybody else on that roster, it wasn't that bad. He's still averaging over 17 touches a game. New England, though, is actually the best team in the NFL against opposing running backs, allowing only 14.2 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, number 1 in the league. Offensive lineman Christian Darrisaw back in concussion protocol, which is not ideal. That could be a huge loss if he isn't able to be cleared in time for this game this week. on the short week, right? So that's a tough one right there for the Vikings. And then lastly, not the best timing for another difficult matchup for Dalvin Cook, right? Back-to-back weeks, not ideal, but just another one of those guys we can't really afford to sit in fantasy football. If you were to bench Dalvin Cook in a difficult matchup and he scores 22 points on your bench and you miss the playoffs because of it, you may not ever want to play fantasy football again, right? That's not a risk we are able to take. But now, let's move on to some Sunday football. How about the Denver Broncos and Carolina Panthers? It's a pretty weird situation here for Denver, right? I mean, so they went out last week. They saw Latavius Murray get 17 carries for 49 yards and then thought it was a good idea to waive Melvin Gordon after losing Chase Edmonds to injury. I mean, I guess the Broncos like sub 3 yards per carry because that's kind of what they're going to get with Latavius Murray. But now you know he's going to get the volume because there really isn't any other options in this backfield. This guy could probably approach 20 to 25 touches a week, especially this week. But it's an inefficient offense on an offense that doesn't score a whole lot, so he needs that volume. If he doesn't get huge volume, he's not getting you fantasy points. But now they're going against Carolina. You remember this Carolina defense that gave up 5 touchdowns to Joe Mixon just a few weeks ago? That's who they're playing this week. They allow over 23 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, but it's just hard to know which Carolina defense shows up. Some weeks they show up, like last week, and you can't do much against them. Other weeks, they basically just take the weekend off. You don't know which one you're going to get. But with Chase Edmonds out, Jerry Jeudy still questionable, KJ Hamler questionable, Mike Boone could be coming back off the IR next week, but that doesn't really help them this week. It's really hard to sit a guy that could get this type of volume in this type of matchup on a team that's going to have to run the ball a little bit. He's got to get at least 18 touches, I would think, this week, and has scored touchdowns now in 3 of his 5 games in Denver. I really prefer to sit Latavius Murray. I don't look at Latavius Murray and be like, I want to put him in my fantasy lineup, but the stars are kind of aligning for him to get the volume in a decent matchup, and if you're looking for a flex play, Latavius Murray isn't bad. I guess. His opponent, Donta Foreman, he's coming off a huge bummer of a week once again in week 11. 11 carries for 24 yards against Baltimore, despite it being a close game. That's what we were looking for going into that matchup. We wanted the game to be close. If it was close, we expected the volume to still be there for Foreman, and we're hoping for a short goal line touchdown. That did not happen, but now the Carolina Panthers have turned over to Sam Darnold under center, and my eggplant is flaccid. I'm not excited about that whatsoever. At this point, I just want him to get back close to 18 touches a game. That's what I'm hoping for. Going up against Denver, they're 22nd in the league. They allow 19 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, but this offensive line is still dealing with injuries, but honestly, most of the offense is just struggling here in Carolina. They can't figure out which quarterback they want to use, and that's what really worries me the most here is that Sam Darnold doesn't give them enough scoring opportunities to have Foreman find the end zone. I hate to do it. He's still a low-end flex, but going to be a sit here for me today. How about the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and Cleveland Browns? We'll start off with Leonard Fournette and Rachaad White. The bye week came at a perfect time for the Bucs. Don't forget, before the bye week, Leonard Fournette left that game with a hip pointer injury, but now all signs are saying he should be good to go in this game this week. But Rachaad White played really well once Fournette went down. He ended that game in week 10 with 22 carries and 105 rushing yards, but got no receiving work, which is a little bit weird. You have to think there's going to be a little bit of a split going forward, and that is fine in this backfield if this offense can get going and start scoring more points. If they continue to struggle on offense, this is going to be a fantasy nightmare. If the Bucs can make a late season run, we may be okay with both of these guys. Now they're going up against Cleveland. They allowed 27.3 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, second most in the league. Lenny, I'm sure, is not 100% healthy, and he is one hit away from re-aggravation. Plus, this offensive line, not exactly 100% either. In a great matchup, with Lenny not being 100% coming off the bye week, we could see both of these guys get decent volume, but for now, Leonard Fournette, until I find out that he's going to be limited or out, is the guy that I'm starting right now. If we find out going into the weekend that Leonard Fournette's going to be limited, he hasn't really practiced all week, he may be missing this game, he's a game time decision, that's when I think about Rachaad White, but I want to wait until we get a little bit deeper into the week until we find out about that. Their opponents, Nick Chubb, Kareem Hunt. Nick Chubb still running back 3 overall on the year. Started off pretty hot in the first quarter last week, and then they completely went away from him. Didn't see much more of him second half of the game. Had a season high in receiving yards with 48, so that helped a little bit. Kareem Hunt really not a factor, only had 7 touches and less pass work than Chubb did. But now they're going against Tampa Bay. They allow the 3rd fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs at 16.3 per game. They're missing 3 offensive linemen who are currently on the injury report, and now back-to-back tough matchups for Nick Chubb is not ideal, but another one of those guys that you just can't afford to sit. He has matchup winning upside every single week. He's the guy we're starting in this backfield. On to Baltimore and Jacksonville. For Baltimore, pass, right? Really not that interested right now. Talk about a split backfield that's absolutely next to impossible to figure out each and every week. You got Kenyon Drake, you got Justice Hill. Heck, we may have Gus Edwards back this week. And imagine if Lamar Jackson decides he wants to start running more, because he hasn't been running that much. Drake, as the lead back, has a hard time getting 10 touches a week, and that is absolutely crazy to me, and that was without Gus Edwards. Who knows what it's going to be like once Gus Bus returns. Now they're going against the Jacksonville Jaguars. They allow over 21 fantasy points per game, 14th most. Aside from Gus himself being questionable, not 100%, we arguably have the best offensive lineman on the team questionable to play as well in Ronnie Stanley, who left last week's game with an ankle injury. There's just too many unknowns here. There's too many options here in the backfield. There's no consistency with anyone. There's no commitment to anyone. And for that reason, I got them all as a sit. Their opponent, good to have Travis Etienne back off the bye week. Coming off one of his worst games of the season, though, prior to the bye. We kind of want to forget about that. He has had a touchdown or over 100 total yards, though, in 3 of his last 4 games played, averaging right around 15 touches per game on the year, but has had 24-plus touches in 2 of the last 3 games played as well. Baltimore, a lot harder to run on than they are to throw on, allowing only 17.6 fantasy points per game to running backs. That's 7th fewest in the league. No other major injuries of concern. Overall, pretty healthy in Jacksonville, but this matchup is tough, but they had an extra week to prep for it, and Etienne is one of the top 2 offensive options in this offense. The big play ability needs to be seen this week. We need a big play from Travis Etienne, because they may stuff him on the line of scrimmage here a few times more than we want to see this weekend. We need one of those big plays to help boost our overall floor. Got Travis Etienne there kind of as a verge start, only with a 15 score. How about Houston and Miami now? We'll start off with Houston and Dameon Pierce, another stud, coming off a game we kind of want to forget, right? He's running back 15 on the year, but last week had 10 carries for 8 damn yards. The hell was that? I mean, Washington just shut him down. That was his first game without 100 total yards or a touchdown since week 2. One of only 5 running backs in the league to at least get 20 touches a game, though, so that's a positive. The volume is still there. Now they're going up against Miami. They allow 20.1 fantasy points per game, 18th most in the league. The offensive line may not be 100%, but the bulk of the injuries are on the defensive side of the football here, and that could lead to a negative game script, which worries me slightly. I'm worried that Miami can go out and get a lead early on Houston, and if they do, they kind of have to abandon the running game and Dameon Pierce once again. He's going to be a start, but be sure to watch my rankings videos because he may be a little bit lower than you're used to seeing him over the last month or two. There is some risk there for Miami. We have another issue here as well. We have 2 solid running backs that are going to split touches in a high-powered offense, and it's going to be impossible to know which one of these guys is going to score each and every week because they both won't always score in every game. They both did. They both had solid games prior to their bye week. They both scored over 16 fantasy points in that ball game in week 10, but Jeff Wilson saw the bulk of the work. He out-touched Raheem Mostert 19-12 in that game. But they're playing the Houston Texans. No team allows more points to running backs than Houston at 28.9 per game. There's no other major injuries of concern here. They're coming off the bye week. Like I said, I could see them with an early lead, running a lot in the second half. It's hard to sit either one of these guys. If I had to put a leader in this backfield, it's Jeff Wilson Jr., and he will be the guy that is higher in my rankings. But Raheem Mostert, not a bad flex play here this week. How about Chicago and the Jets? We'll start off with David Montgomery. Monty's looking pretty good as a solo guy in this backfield. Once again, he was RB6 overall on the week just last week, had just over 120 total yards and a touchdown in week 11. That's what we like to see, and he should be in line for a similar amount of work here this week, but maybe even more. He's averaging 15 touches a game, but like I said, I expect that number to grow now that he's the only guy really getting solid volume in that backfield, but they're going against the Jets, and the Jets D has been pretty good against the run, allowing only 18.9 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. That's 23rd in the league. The offensive line may be dealing with injuries, but the big one here for me is Justin Fields. We saw late in that game last week that he wasn't running as much to try to limit the amount of hits that he took on his non-throwing shoulder, the shoulder in which he injured earlier in that game. Does that happen again this week? Does he favor his shoulder enough to where he's not scrambling as much and we're just utilizing David Montgomery more in a difficult matchup? He may make up for some inefficiencies in this game by getting a good amount of touches, so I'm going to start David Montgomery. His opponent there, Michael Carter, James Robinson, another backfield I'm still not interested in. I mean, there's not a whole lot to really say about this backfield. They're going to split work in an offense that is just not great, and they're running behind an offensive line that has been decimated with injuries throughout the year. This team just doesn't score enough. Both of these guys can't even get to 10 touches a game. Chicago, not a bad matchup. They allow the 5th most fantasy points to running backs, but this offensive line has to be one of the most injured of all teams in the NFL this year. You can see that they have nowhere to run when they get the ball. The quarterback, Zach Wilson, has no time to do anything in the pocket. Could they break off a big run? Could they score a touchdown? Sure. If there were bye weeks, maybe we think about one of these guys, but nobody's on bye, and there are so many better options this week that I'm not willing to tempt it with the backfield of the Jets. They're both a sit. How about Cincinnati and Tennessee? Joe Mixon and Samaje Perine is somebody we're going to talk about now, because Joe Mixon was having a pretty solid day before leaving that game last week with a concussion, and Samaje Perine took advantage of it. 82 total yards, 3 receiving touchdowns, was running back 2 on the week, and I can't help but think, man, that would have been great if that was Joe Mixon with those points, but it wasn't. Mixon's still sitting at running back 7 overall on the season. Mixon's just averaging under 20 touches a game. Perine hasn't had double-digit touches since week 3 until last week. Now, Tennessee, pretty tough to run on, allowing only 16.2 fantasy points per game, 4th fewest in the league. When it comes to injuries, we're watching Joe Mixon. Is he going to clear concussion protocol in time to play in this game? It is extremely possible, and that's why I still have him listed as the start and not Samaje Perine. But obviously, if Joe Mixon were to not play in this game, Samaje Perine will be the guy that I start in this backfield. We need to wait and see if Mixon is healthy. Perine probably going to flirt with single-digit touches once again, and it's really hard to start a guy in a week that there's just so many options. So we're waiting to see on Joe Mixon right now. If he's ruled out, then we'll go Samaje Perine. Their opponent's Derrick Henry. Of course, you're starting Derrick Henry. He's running back 2 on the year, coming off another solid game in which he had over 130 total yards, multiple touchdowns, even a passing touchdown last week from Derrick Henry to Austin Hooper. You already know he's a guy going to get 20-plus touches. Going against Cincinnati, they're allowing right around 19.5 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Offensive lineman Ben Jones is still hurt, but the rest of their injuries are on defense as well. Derrick Henry is only 2 receptions away from a new career high. Think about that. There's still, 7 games left for him to play. I think we're seeing a career high in receiving this year from Derrick Henry, to all those PPR guys that said he's still not a good pick. Love it. Love to see Derrick Henry. Of course, he's a start. Atlanta and Washington now. Cordero Patterson, Tyler Algier. This one was really tough for me, because I know what Cordero Patterson is capable of. We've seen him do it before in this offense, but hasn't really done a whole lot for the last couple weeks. Sure, he scored a touchdown last week, but that was on a kick return. I'll take it. Fantasy points are fantasy points. But what I'm hoping for now is, with Kyle Pitts no longer in the lineup, can we get a little bit more passing work going the way of Cordero Patterson? He hasn't had more than 2 targets in a game since week 1. What are we doing, Atlanta? We need to get this guy the ball more frequently in space. Throw him the football. He's still averaging just over 13 touches a game on the season, and now we're starting to see the volume diminish from Tyler Algier as well. It's starting to drop down into single digits once again. But now they're going up against Washington, who has been playing absolutely lights out lately against running backs. They're allowing 17 fantasy points per game on the year to running backs, 6th fewest in the NFL. And if I had to say, I think they're getting better as the season is going on. We know that Kyle Pitts won't be involved. Guard Jalen Mayfield is questionable, and center Matt Hennessy is still on the IR as well. This team is fighting for a division. Cordarrelle Patterson is arguably probably their best offensive weapon on this team. You have to think that they're going to go all in on him and try to utilize his skill set a little bit more. But with the low volume and the risk there in a difficult matchup, my gut says I kind of want to play him, but all the numbers and everything says not to. And sometimes we just have to pay attention to what's in front of us and kind of just trust your gut. I want to start Cordarrelle Patterson, but in this difficult matchup, in an offense that still hasn't proven that they want to give him more and more touches, I have him as a fringe sit. Their opponents, Antonio Gibson and Brian Robinson, another backfield with commitment issues here. 1 week it's Gibby, the next week it's Brian Robinson, and then it's back and forth. Gibby now has back-to-back games with at least 100 total yards or a touchdown, while B-Rob, he just remains touchdown dependent because he's not getting very many of them. Both these guys could easily get 20 touches a game, but there's no rhyme or reason as to when that's going to happen. Don't forget, 2 weeks ago, B-Rob saw like 26 touches. Last week, it was Gibby that got the volume. You just don't know what to expect, but now they're going up against Atlanta, a team that you typically want to start your running backs against. They allow over 21 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, 12th most in the league. No other new major injury concerns here, but Gibby is the one getting the pass work. So when you're looking at a backfield that's kind of struggling with touches, I'm looking for the guy with the pass catching work to give me the safer floor. In a decent matchup, Antonio Gibson is the way that I'm going here this week because Brian Robinson just needs those touchdowns too badly in order to become a start. Antonio Gibson can still score you 10 fantasy points and not find the end zone. That's really hard for Brian Robinson to do at this point, and that's why he's a sit. How about the Chargers and the Arizona Cardinals now? I don't know about you, but I feel like it's a good idea to start the number one running back in fantasy football, Austin Eckler, especially since these targets, they could continue with Mike Williams being hurt once again. He's getting right around 19 touches a game. Arizona allowing over 21 fantasy points per contest. We know that Gerald Everett's still questionable along with Mike Williams, and there's just no way you ever sit Austin Eckler. We're not even thinking about it. How about James Conner? Is it just me? And be honest with me, because I'm the hugest critic of the Cardinals being a Cardinals fan. But watching that game last week, I felt like James Conner just looked slow. It looks like he was never a high top-end speed guy. I get that. He wasn't a burner, but he looks a little bit more like a plotter right now, and I don't know what happened to some of that burst and acceleration that we saw in years past. He's barely averaging 3 yards per carry, but still finds the end zone pretty freaking consistently in this offense. Back-to-back games now with over 16 touches, and has had touchdowns against the Rams and the 49ers in back-to-back weeks. You're not going to get much more difficult matchups than that. The Chargers, definitely a lot easier. They allow the third most fantasy points to opposing running backs at 25.9 per game. There's still multiple injuries on this offensive line. Greg Dortch is hurt. Kyler Murray is questionable. Hollywood Brown hasn't returned just yet. Rondale Moore is now hurt. Zach Ertz is on IR. It may just be the James Conner show out there for the most part on Sunday. Maybe he could rack up a lot more receptions and really give you a great day here this week as well. He may be one of the only healthy weapons outside of DeAndre Hopkins here right now. So expect the touches to continue, and I'm going to start James Conner. How about the Las Vegas Raiders? Seattle Seahawks will start off with Josh Jacobs, who's currently up to running back 4 overall on the year, averaging almost 18 fantasy points per game. Another week with over 100 plus total yards. Has had now 100 yards or a touchdown in 5 of his last 7 games played. Has broken now into the category of 20 touches a contest at 21.7. Going up against Seattle, they allow the 8th most fantasy points to opposing running backs at 22 per game. Offensive lineman Colton Miller still somewhat banged up. This just feels like the Raiders are back to saying, you know what? We tried to get cute. We tried to, do other things, but we're just going back to what works. It's Devontae Adams, it's Josh Jacobs. They're dominating touches right now, and they're finding a lot of success with those two guys, so I don't see them stopping in a matchup like this. So Jacobs is going to be a start for Kenneth Walker. Good to have him back off his bye week. Currently running back 19 overall in fantasy football. Another one of those guys that had a bad game prior to the bye. Only had 10 carries for 17 yards, 8 targets, 6 receptions, and 55 yards in the air against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, but the touchdown upside continues to be there each and every week for this guy, so much so that that alone almost makes him a weekly start. He hasn't had less than 16 touches in a game since becoming the starter in Seattle. Las Vegas allows the 4th most fantasy points to opposing running backs at 24 per game. No new major injury concerns here coming off the bye week. He just checks all the boxes of what you're looking for when you're trying to find a running back to start in fantasy football, so he'll remain a start for me. How about the Rams and the Chiefs? For the Rams, let me get this straight for a second. Okay, so the Rams lead towards Darrell Henderson to start the year. The Rams piss off Cam Akers. He wants to be traded. He leaves the team for some time. Then he comes back. Okay, then we're almost at current day situation. And then all of a sudden, Akers starts getting some touches, doesn't really do anything with them, and they waive Darrell Henderson. This team is an absolute shambles. This is some Cleveland Brown level stuff going on right here in LA. It's a mess for sure. This is now an overall unproductive backfield running behind a very injured offensive line with potentially their 3rd string quarterback starting for them because Matthew Stafford is in concussion protocol and John Wolford is injured. Then they're going against the Kansas City Chiefs, which isn't a bad matchup for them, but you have to think that the Chiefs are going to get a lead, and if they get a lead, we're not going to rely on the running game in LA. This is just an absolute mess in a backfield that I really don't want a whole lot to do with. I know a lot of people are pumped about Kyren Williams and his opportunity. I love Kyren Williams. I love the talent of Kyren Williams. I don't love the situation for this kid. I don't know if either one of these guys are really set up to succeed. They're going to need one of those days where they get 14 carries for 36 yards, but they find the end zone twice because it was 2 goal line touchdowns. Like, that's what I can see happening. Best case scenario. Overall, though, I'm not interested in this backfield. Their opponent, Isaiah Pacheco, now has back-to-back games, and I guess what you would call the lead back role for the Kansas City Chiefs. He's averaging 90 yards rushing in back-to-back games, but seems to be allergic to the pass-catching work because he's not getting any of it. He's running really well, I will say that, averaging over 5 yards per carry over the last 2 games, but just hasn't been able to find the end zone since week 1, and that really caps his overall ceiling. Now they're going against the Rams. They are harder to run on than they are to throw on, allowing 18 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. That's 25th in the league. All of the injuries, though, for this team really seem to help Isaiah Pacheco. Juju, Kadarius Toney, Mecole Hardman, CEH, all leads to more volume going the way of Isaiah Pacheco because there's not a lot of other options. He's going to be a low-end start for me. Verge top 24 due to the touches that he's going to see and being very touchdown dependent. Remember, the kid is doing great. He's just not getting the touchdown opportunities because Patrick Mahomes is throwing it to everyone else. Isaiah Pacheco is still going to be a start for me, though. Now on to New Orleans and the San Francisco 49ers. We'll start off with Alvin Kamara. Yet another down game for Alvin Kamara, as we see Chris Olave and Jarvis Landry, even Juwan Johnson being the guys in this offense to get the scoring opportunities. It's been 3 weeks now since a touchdown for Alvin Kamara, and he hasn't scored over 10 fantasy points in 3 straight games either, averaging right around 13 touches a game over those last 3 contests. And I can't help but think that it's because others are becoming more prominent in this offense. Do you remember earlier in the season when I said the reason Alvin Kamara was doing so good is he was the only show in town because everyone was hurt? As Chris Olave is getting more experience, as Juwan Johnson is getting more opportunities in this playbook, as Jarvis Landry is coming back from injury, we're seeing less and less and less of Alvin Kamara. And now he gets to go against the San Francisco 49ers, the team that allows the second fewest fantasy points in the NFL to running backs at 14.4 per game. We know when it comes to injuries, the offensive line has some nagging injuries, but most of their injuries also on defense. How many times have we seen this guy go out, though, and score 2, 3, 4 touchdowns in a game? Just another one of those guys, even though it's a difficult matchup, even though he's been struggling, can't really afford to sit Alvin Kamara, but he will be lower in my rankings. More of a risky start for me here this week. On the opposite side of the football, we got Christian McCaffrey, we got Elijah Mitchell. Now, CMC, he's sitting at running back 5 overall on the season, and he's looking real good in this offense in the Bay. Over 100 total yards or a touchdown now in 3 straight games. But man, when Elijah Mitchell comes in the ballgame, he looks so good as well. He's averaging almost 6 yards per carry himself. Now, I love the pass work that Christian McCaffrey is getting, 6+ targets in 3 straight ball games, putting him right at 19 touches per game. We know Elijah Mitchell's going to kind of get the scraps, right? He's not going to go out there and be the lead guy in this backfield each and every week, but the Saints are harder to run on than they are to throw on. They're allowing only 18.6 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, and this backfield's still pretty split. No other major injury concerns here, but with CMC getting the majority of the touches, he'll still be the guy that I start in this backfield. Elijah Mitchell is a player that I love, though, and I went and tried to get him in every league that I possibly could, because if anything happens to CMC, Elijah Mitchell is like pure gold going in to the fantasy playoffs. How about the Green Bay Packers and the Philadelphia Eagles? We'll start off with the Packers. Aaron Jones, A.J. Dillon. Really not going to discuss A.J. Dillon much, why he hasn't earned it and done a whole lot this entire season. Jones sitting right now at running back 9 overall on the year. He's scored at least 10 fantasy points in 4 of his last 5, so a little bit of consistency there, all while A.J. Dillon just runs backwards, it feels like. Jones averaging right around 16.5 touches per game, which is great. Philadelphia allowing 20.6 fantasy points per game to running backs. That's 17th in the NFL. But the recent additions of Ndamukong Suh and Linval Joseph on that defensive line is going to help bring that number down a little bit. No other main new injuries of concern here. Really, I'm more worried about the game script here and if they fall behind early to the Philadelphia Eagles. There needs to be a big play in this game or a touchdown for Aaron Jones. Otherwise, he's probably going to bust for a lot of people, but I trust him way more to get that touchdown or that big play than I do A.J. Dillon. Hopefully, he can find light. Hopefully, Aaron Rodgers will include him in some of that pass-catching work that we've seen here in weeks past. That's why I will start Aaron Jones. How about Miles Sanders? He's sitting right now at running back 17 overall. Hasn't really done anything now, though, in back-to-back ball games. No passing work to be seen. Only getting 12 to 13 carries now in back-to-back games. That's under his season average, which is sitting at 17 per game. Green Bay allowing the 7th most points to running backs, though. 22 points per game. It's a good matchup here for Miles Sanders. We know Dallas Goedert's still not going to be out there on the offense. I'm just a little bit worried about the decrease in touches and the lack of pass-catching work here over the last few games. It's going to start making this guy a little bit more touchdown dependent, which I don't love when it comes to my running backs. But in a good matchup like this, I'm going to go ahead and start Miles Sanders. And then lastly, Monday Night Football. We got the Pittsburgh Steelers, Indianapolis Colts, Najee Harris. Najee up to running back 20 overall on the season, coming off his best game of the year by far, 116 total yards and 2 touchdowns. And it's really helping him not having Jaylen Warren to really worry about while he's injured. He's had now 20 carries in back-to-back games, which is great. He didn't have any all year prior to these last 2 games. Going up against Indianapolis, they're a middle-of-the-pack defense against the run, allowing 19.7 fantasy points per game. Offensive lineman Mason Cole is questionable to play, but what's weird to me is as we got reports that Najee was dealing with knee soreness, he looks healthier now than there were reports of him being 100% healthy. I don't know if they're doing that on purpose or whatever it is, but Najee looked pretty good last week overall. Love the volume, love the matchup. I'm going to start Najee Harris this week. And then Jonathan Taylor, we know we start Jonathan Taylor each and every week. He's sitting at running back 25 and is on the climb right now. Back-to-back games with a touchdown. Starting to look a little bit more like Jonathan Taylor, right? Maybe not 100%, but more than what we saw for most of the season. Was Frank Reich really holding this guy back? I mean, can we say that? I don't know if that's the case, but it sure seems like it because he's running hard for Jeff Saturday when he was barely playing for Frank Reich. He's had 24 plus touches now in back-to-back games with head coach Jeff Saturday, and they just gave the Eagles all they could handle last week. Now they get the Pittsburgh Steelers. They allow over 20 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. No other new major injuries of concern here, and even though Pittsburgh is playing a little bit better on defense than their numbers may suggest, this isn't going to be a cakewalk, but we're not sitting Jonathan Taylor on Monday Night Football. All right, so there you have it. My running back starts and sits here for Thanksgiving week, week 12 fantasy football. I want to take a quick second, make sure I thank the community of Headliner Nation out there for all the support throughout this year. I hope that you guys have a great Thanksgiving week. Spend some time with your family, have some delicious food, watch some amazing football, sit back, relax, maybe do a little bit of Black Friday shopping and get your 2023 draft guide pre-ordered so you already know you're good to go next season. Thank you so much for all the support out there. I'm going to get out of here for the day. Hopefully you have a great rest of your day, a great weekend, and we'll talk to you later.